Studio is in high spirits this morning, boy. Like they catch the spirit, eh? So the Institute of Surveyors of Trinidad and Tobago is hosting a land policy conference, all right, on administration for sustainable development. So we do have here with us this morning, Dr. Charisse Griffith-Charles, surveyor, senior lecturer, UWI. And we do have Mr. Colvin Blaize, land surveyor, attorney at law. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for hosting us.
Yes, anytime, anytime. Doctor, let's start with the land policy conference. Why is this so important?
Oh, it's extremely important. Land policy is important for setting a vision for the country and where it wants to go and how land can take it there. And so we therefore have to build awareness. We have to get everybody into the conversation about land policy.
Yeah. Do we have a land policy?
Of course, we have a land policy.
Yes.
And it's critical that we have a land policy. And the land policy, that overarching vision that we have with respect to what we want to be able to do with land and how we want to develop it, especially in the standpoint of sustainable development. So that's critical. You must have that first. And then all of the other components, now with an appreciation of what that vision is, all of the other components then fit in with respect to achieving that particular objective. So you'll have like town and country, let's say, where they will have a land use policy that will fit in to that particular overarching vision or land policy. So it's critical, one, that we have a land policy and we appreciate what that land policy is. And it's also important that we get everyone into the conversation with respect to this is the vision, this is where we are going. We want everyone on board with respect to reaching there. And that's why policy and different types of seminars that the Institute will host similar to this is important to be able to bring as much people as possible into that discussion, into that appreciation of the vision, so that we could all move forward in the same direction.
And
Doctor,
it's not really, sorry about,
yes,
it's not really about having a land policy. We have to understand that land policy has to grow and evolve and change because we have new issues coming on board, and the land policy has to envelop what is going on in the society.
Who is the land policy for? And are people aware about what is in this land policy?
People may not be too aware about what is in the land policy. The land policy, actually in Trinidad and Tobago, we don't have a documented land policy. And that is something that we need to get towards, having a documented land policy. We can discern what the policy of the state is from some legislation that is being put in place, but we need to develop a documented land policy that says specifically what is the vision, as was mentioned.
Doctor, I'm hearing you speaking and I'm saying, wait, we don't have a land policy. So if we do not have a land policy, as the doctor is saying, so what guidelines are people following?
No, she said we don't have a documented.
A document, okay.
Right? But that doesn't mean, from the standpoint of what has been articulated by the politicians, by the government, that there's not a general policy with respect to where we want to go. That is important. That is what must guide all of the other institutions. Everything that we do, the land administration, town and country planning, that guides them with respect to how we're moving forward. Recently, up to last year, the town and country amended certain of their guidelines with respect to buildings and structures and densities in Port of Spain. All of that was geared into a particular land policy that dealt with, we need to develop Port of Spain area. So to say that, as she was saying, we don't have a documented, but to say we don't have one totally is not necessarily accurate.
Yeah. So do you for us to be speaking about a land policy this morning, it means that you feel that there has to be a policy and maybe a document that persons have to follow rigidly, in a rigid way.
Yes. So, yes, as I said, we don't have something documented in one set place that we can say these are the guidelines we're following. But we can see that from the actions and the decisions that are made, we can see whether it is more social or an economic or what are the visions that the state would have. But we need to develop, and we need to get everybody speaking in concert to develop this one way of how we're going forward.
You feel that people have been following the guidelines that we have thus far?
Well, guidelines. The short answer that I would say probably is as a general statement, yes, there have been instances where people have not. The instances where they have not and they have led to disastrous consequences highlighted, so be more aware of that. But I think generally from the standpoint, and again, I come back to town and country, there has been, from the standpoint of land use, there has been that general compliance. And there have been areas where they have not. And we have felt the consequences of it, whether it be flooding, or whether it be erosion on the hill, whether it be a number of adverse effects. Yes. So yes, there has been compliance, but yes, there has also not be full compliance. But this land policy, this discussion that we will want to have, we are hoping that we can sensitize persons about what the issues are. And hopefully they would then better be able to answer the question, how does this affect me? And better be able to say, okay, you know what, let me work towards compliance and fulfilling that eventual land policy that we want to have in place.
But is there not a need for, and I want to use the word policing, there has to be a greater enforcement of guidelines and policing of guidelines in Trinidad and Tobago, because as you would have alluded to, during the wet season, the rainy season that we would have seen massive apartments, buildings on the hillside being threatened. The retaining walls have fallen down. We're seeing major landslips that it would take millions of dollars to fix. We're seeing flooding in places, let's say in Port of Spain, where we have not seen flooding before.
Well, one of the issues of implementing a land policy is that we need to have data. And this is where us as professionals come in. The Institute of Surveyors of Trinidad and Tobago is a professional association for land surveyors, quantity surveyors, and valuation surveyors. And, you know, there are institutions in the state that are supposed to gather the data on ownership, value, and use, and present this data in a public, transparent way so that people can see what is happening. And if these institutions are under-resourced, then we don't have enough data to make the decisions. Do you know how many landslides there were, for example? Do you know how much compliance with land policies there were? We need to have that data mapped so that we can go forward and say, well, okay, we're not getting success in this area, we're getting success in this area. How is climate change affecting us? And that database, that grouping of databases, that integration of those databases is necessary for us to go forward.
Yeah. So I suspect it is safe to say that this land policy is long overdue. Let's speak a little bit about the conference and what do you hope to achieve at the conference? We know that you want to bring all the stakeholders together to discuss this and yes, come up with a policy at the end of the day.
Right. So we have a lot of interesting presentations on sustainability for mineral resources, climate change, and how it affects different aspects of development in Trinidad and Tobago, land tenure, and environmental issues, hazards and disasters, which we'll speak to, the flooding, etc. And so all of these discussions will happen, and we hope at the end of it that everybody takes part and comes together to see, well, what should our vision be? What is the priority for our vision as we go forward in developing this documented land policy?
And I think it's important that we have this discussion because sometimes people don't see the tree for the forest.
Yes.
And we need to be able to, all the various component parts come together and say, hey, you know what, this is what is happening. And then say, well, because we're doing this, and make the connections. This is why we have a conference such as this, so that we could get all the different component parts that come, say, these are the problem, these are the successes. We make the connection so that we can then come up with a proper solution at the end of the day. And the discussion is important. So when you look at the presentation deals with the issue of squatting, the presentation that deals with the issue of having land policy. All of those, each person, agriculture as well. So each person that is in one way or the next associated with each one of those different areas, you need to be at that conference. You need to be able to have that conversation. We need to be able to hear from you. You need to be able to hear from us. You need to be able to hear from everyone so that we can then be able to advance an understanding generally of the land policy and how we can move forward. But that general understanding is critical.
Yeah. There's a perception, and I agree a bit with the perception. You could disagree if you'd like. But when it comes to, let's say, planning and development in Trinidad and Tobago, things are being done in a sort of willy-nilly way. And I know that we have agencies such as the regional corporations in place and town and country planning and so on. But we're seeing some strange things. We're seeing squatting developments popping up in almost every community.
Yeah. But you talk about two different things. Yes, I disagree with you.
Go ahead.
All right. So it's one thing to say you have planning policy.
Yes.
And then it's another thing to say that there are certain things taking place on the ground that do not adhere to that planning policy.
Yeah.
So you can't necessarily blame the policy. From an enforcement standpoint, you can say, hey, yo, you have your policy in place. Then you need to be able to put more effort into the issue of enforcement.
Of course.
But even the issue of enforcement is multifaceted. One is to be able to do it, and two is to be able to have that political will as well. Because sometimes we may understand, especially on the issue of squatting, that they may have certain political issues. So squatting along the riverbed, it's flood, during the rainy season, big problem. Oh gosh, look, I flood out. But you're not adhering to planning policy.
Yeah,
so when you reap the benefit of it,
Yes, and squatting points to a social issue.
Yes.
You have to look at the underlying social issue that people don't have sustainable housing. And therefore, the land policy is supposed to say, well, what is our priority? What is our vision for addressing the social issue of housing in our land policy? Is that the priority area? Do we focus our attention on a sustainable housing? Or do we now, because we know that food is getting very expensive, do we focus our land policy on sustainable food? And then, it's a different way of concerting our efforts and your energies and your limited resources and economic resources into a particular direction.
Yeah.
So it may be that you have to look at the underlying social issue and not just look at, there's squatting, or there's no food in the markets.
So even with that little conversation, you start seeing the connections between all the different component parts. And it's so important for us to be able to appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, the conversation and the conference better late than ever, because maybe this should have happened about 20, 30 years ago. Just my view. But let's get back.
Everything happens when it's supposed to.
All right. Let's get back to the conference on what period of time, on what days?
Okay, it will be on the 22nd and 23rd of March. So that's next week. It's you have a short space of time for you to get registered and come to the conference. Decide to take your time out to come to the conference. It will be from 8 to 4 on each of those 2 days, and it will be held at the University Inn and Conference Center, which is just outside the university.
University Drive.
On University. St. Augustine Circular Road.
Yeah.
Right.
So there's still time to register. How does one register?
Okay, so you can contact the Institute at 683-3643 or 468-3356.
Yeah, so we do have the numbers up on the screen, so you can make a note of those numbers.
Or you may even also send an email, I don't know if that is there as well, to info@instituteofsurveyors.com. And then, to get relevant information with respect to the issue of registration.
Yeah. Who is the conference for? Go ahead.
Sorry. One other thing I was going to say, there's also the ability for online participation as well.
Yes.
So once you get in contact, you indicate whether in person or online, and you'll be given the information with respect to registration for both.
Yeah. And who is the conference for? When I say who's the conference for, who are some of the persons that you would like to see register for the conference and to participate and to have discussions as it relates to the policy?
Okay. Well, the professionals certainly would want to engage in the conference. So land surveyors, quantity surveyors, valuation surveyors, attorneys, engineers, planners, people who are involved in land. But of course, everybody, every single person must be interested in what is going on in their country. So everyone should attend, everyone. And if you have land or if you don't have land, you should be interested in how land is allocated in Trinidad and Tobago.
Yeah, and there would also be the intervention, let's say, of the ministries and regional corporations and so on, all stakeholders.
Of course, yes.
All right, we just have a few seconds again before we end our interview. Anything else you all would like to add?
Well, be there. All right,
it's imperative. It's imperative. It's imperative.
And it's important because to get that general conversation going, that is critical. And from the standpoint of the Institute, our mandate with respect to the issue of disseminating information with respect to the profession and bringing in that conversation, that is something certainly that we view very seriously. And this is one of the means by which we do that.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you very much for coming this morning.
Thank you for
having us. Thank you very much for having us.
All right, anytime. So let's get a traffic update now from the Eddie Hart. Coming back.
But I can't understand why